So I never ended up doing a Friday Reads this past Friday, even though I meant to, but I went to see two movies instead. And I didn't really have time to sit down and film really for the rest of the weekend, even though I wanted to, and I had a stack of books prepared to talk to you about, to tell you what I'd read the weekend before when I had a long weekend and so much time on my hands. So it's Wednesday. Well, no, it's Tuesday. It's Tuesday. I'm getting my days mixed up. It's Tuesday, and so I'll call this a Tuesday Reads. What I've read and what I intend to read over the rest of the week. So if you recall from my last Friday Reads video, I had been finishing up The Age of Reason by Sartre, which was a reread for me. And because of that, I ended up picking up his novel Iron and the Soul. I'm going to show you my copy here. I actually have Age of Reason in this edition too, but it's not the edition that I read because I have a solid blue penguin of it. But I picked up Age of Reason, which is actually the third book in the series, and I hadn't read the second one, but I read them out of order because this is what I had, and I'd had a lot of difficulty actually finding book number 2, The Reprieve, which incidentally I walked into Black Squirrel Books here in Ottawa the day after I finished this and finally found it. And I did start reading it, but I've actually set it aside for about a week now because I really haven't read much. I've been busy with other things. But Iron and the Soul was a really great novel. It's set in the Second World War, just as France is falling to the Germans. And so we have several characters. This trilogy, this series of novels, follows Mathieu, who is kind of one of our main characters, but then we also have Daniel, and I think there's another guy whose name is Boris, and Marcel, and some other people that are involved in the original story, The Age of Reason, and their lives are interconnected, and so we follow them kind of haphazardly through this trilogy, through The Reprieve, and then some of the characters in Iron and the Soul. What I didn't like so much about Iron and the Soul compared to Age of Reason, it could have been a translation issue, or the way the novel was set up, but it was difficult to follow who was narrating because as you can see, it's very, very blockish. There's no headings or anything. Even when you come to chapters, it's really just dates at the top. And so one minute you're reading one perspective, and then all of a sudden you're in another perspective, and sometimes you have to backtrack to realize that, oh, I'm reading Boris now and not Mathieu. When did that change happen? So I did have a little bit of an understanding issue there, and I did go back and read some passages. I would get like a few sentences in, realize, oh my goodness, now this is from the perspective of a woman. Which woman is this? Still a very, very interesting novel, although Sartre is very, very overt with his theme here. The trilogy is about freedom. What does it mean to be free? Can you really be free? Turns out you can only be free in death. So that's what happens here. But I read that one, liked it. Nowhere near as good as The Age of Reason. I'm into The Reprieve here, which takes place begins in September of 38 in a heat wave. The Munich conference is happening, and it's the build-up to the start of that war. And when I started this, I thought it was kind of funny because they had a heat wave in the novel. There was a heat wave here in Ottawa. The heat wave is kind of back, although not as extreme. We had one day where it was a beautiful high of 24, and now we're up to about a high of 30 again every day, which my body really, really, really doesn't like. I actually stayed home from work today because I woke up with a horrible headache, just kind of achy joints, and I've been really, really exhausted and tired, and I've been sleeping a lot more than usual, so I really can't wait for kind of those brisk fall days. I used to love the heat, but I just can't handle it like I used to. I guess this is what happens when you start to get old. So I've been reading The Reprieve, and I'm still working my way through Simone de Beauvoir's wartime diary. This here, I've got the dust jacket off. I think I paid about $35 or $40 Canadian for this off Amazon. Something I didn't even realize was out there. And I may have talked about this in my last video, but these are her journals from 1939 all the way up into 1941. So just the beginning of that war. I think it takes us right up to that occupation of Paris. So these are really good. I'm probably going to dig into these this afternoon. I dropped a class because I hated it. I decided to take an additional class in the fall instead of the additional class this summer. And so now I've got all this time on my hands and I can enjoy myself some more again. But last weekend, not this past weekend, the weekend before, the weekend I would have been talking about if I had done a Friday Reeves on Friday, I was seeking shelter from the heat and I took The Beautiful Summer by Césaire Pavese with an introduction by Elizabeth Strout to a bar, and I had some food and I sat and read this little volume. It's a coming-of-age story. I think I actually ended up ordering it because I heard another booktuber talk about it and it sounded very interesting. Not as interesting as I thought it would be, but it's about a young woman who she kind of gets drawn into this world of artists and older men when a friend of hers is posing as a nude model for artists. She gets paid, she stands there naked, she gets painted, and she brings her friend, the main character's name is actually Gianna, and the girl who's posing is Amelia. Amelia brings Gianna into this world of artists, and Gianna has a crush and sort of a relationship with one of the artists. You get the sense that perhaps she's got a bit of a crush on Amelia as well. Very, very short little novella here. Interesting, but not something I dive into and read again. If you'd read this, I would love to hear what you thought of it, whether you got something more out of it than I did. I'm probably going to be passing this on to the secondhand shop. In that heat wave, I sat down and read a book that I had gotten from the library a couple months ago and hadn't read yet. And this is by Morley Callaghan. Now, Morley Callaghan is a famous Canadian writer, and he was acquainted with Ernest Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald, and he spent a summer in Paris with them. He first met Hemingway when Hemingway was writing for the Toronto Star. He was still in school himself, but because he was such a great reporter, he got himself a job on the Toronto Star and ended up meeting Hemingway, sharing his writing with Hemingway, getting encouragement from Hemingway, and he started sending short stories and pieces of writing to where Hemingway was staying in Paris. And Hemingway was passing this around to editors, to publishers, to writers, and Morley Callaghan's first novel was actually passed to a publisher in New York, I believe, by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And at the time, when he went to meet the publisher, Callaghan was a little bit confused, a little bit in awe, because he knew Fitzgerald's writing, but he'd actually never met the man, and he assumed that it had been Hemingway who had passed his writing along to this publisher. And so in that way, he gets drawn into the lives of Hemingway, who almost seemed threatened by him. I think this book was probably published with the goal that it would make him some money, with the goal that it would make publishers some money, because it's not really about Callaghan, it's more of a tell-all about his relationship with Hemingway and his relationship with Scott Fitzgerald. Both those relationships only lasted for that summer for a few years after. There was an incident, actually. A reporter claimed that Callaghan and Hemingway had met on a street, and Hemingway had challenged Callaghan to a boxing match. Hemingway was very big on his boxing. He thought he was a great boxer. Callaghan had actually done competitive boxing as well. Hemingway seemed to insinuate throughout the relationship that Callaghan was kind of lying about his boxing, copying Hemingway's own writing about boxing, when in reality Callaghan was writing about boxing from his own perspective, and that's why it showed up in a piece of his writing. But there was kind of a tension, a competition of personalities between Callaghan and Hemingway, and I guess a reporter, someone in a newspaper, picked up on that and spun a false story about Hemingway challenging Callaghan to a boxing match, and they did indeed box. But in this story, Callaghan knocks Hemingway out with one punch, and Hemingway sends, well actually, Hemingway by way of Scott Fitzgerald sends a very kind of indignant, nasty telegram demanding a retraction from Callaghan. And Callaghan claims he had already sent off a note to the newspaper in question who had published this story telling them it was false, but Callaghan was pretty offended by the fact that Hemingway and Scott felt that he was the one who should be retracting this story, that it was on him, and so he was offended by that and claims that's the reason why their friendship ended, because he wasn't interested in knowing them anymore. Although a lot of this memoir is about Fitzgerald's drinking, about him getting drunk, about Hemingway getting in fights, about them boxing together, about them challenging each other. So it really is just kind of a tell-all that was probably published all those years later. I think the publication date was in the 50s, 1963 actually. It was published in 1963, likely as a moneymaker late in life. No judgment on the quality of the work though, because it was quite interesting to read. We've got photographs of Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald in here. So I read that. Then I ended up picking up one of Morley Callaghan's novels because I'd never actually read one. So this is It's Never Over in one of the Laurentian Library editions. And this is about 3 young people who are recoiling after the execution of their mutual acquaintance. In one case it's the brother, in one case it's the former lover, in one case it's the former best friend. They're recoiling after the state execution of their friend Fred, who was convicted of accidentally killing a policeman in a barroom brawl. This was published in 1930, so it would have been a speakeasy and a legal establishment. And so when the police came in to break things up, arrest people, Fred ended up getting in a brawl with this policeman, shoving him, knocking him down, and the policeman apparently hit his head and died. And we're left with John, Lillian, and what was the other character's name? Isabel. Isabel was Fred's sister. The sister Isabel and Lily and John kind of recoiling from this death, kind of from the shame that society has put on them for being associated with a man who has been executed by the state, and their twisted, tangled relationship that ensues. So quite a good novel there, 1930, It's Never Over. Great Canadian writer. Then I read a collection of short stories by Sartre, The Wall and Other Stories. The Wall was extremely good. I really did like that. The Room was great as well. Some of these stories have those real zingers at the end that kind of make you go, oh my goodness, did that really happen? That seems to be his style. Other stories are kind of like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and we're done. Thank you for looking at this profile of a leader. That's what happens in Childhood of a Leader. Interesting collection. It was kind of odd because the library edition I have seems to be like a large print edition. So I'm holding this massive book and reading these giant words. It's bound really badly. A lot of the pages are stuck together, and so on this page, for instance, I couldn't read what was in the margins because the binding had essentially glued the two pages together, and someone, in trying to separate it, had torn off a strip along the margin, cutting off some letters. Also, there's some really weird things with the paper in here. So I noticed there were corners folded down, and I was like, oh, someone folded the corners. Nope, the corners are folded because the paper is cut odd, and so you've got giant corners that someone has tried to essentially put out of the way, and it's just really odd. There's one, I can't find it now, but it's absolutely massive, and I'm trying to figure out how they let that book pass inspection like that and be sold. Anyway, so I read that. What I'm reading now, in addition to the Wartime Diary and the Reprieve, is I'm doing a buddy read of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. We're both kind of off track. I was originally going to do this with another booktuber, but she bailed on me saying she hated Victorian literature, so like 2 pages into on the first day, and we were going to do like 15% a day, but someone else stepped in, and so he and I have been reading this, and I think we're going to finish over the next couple of days. We're both finding it pretty enjoyable, I think, although these characters are characters that you just love to hate when you read it. I think this is the first time I've actually read this edition, and I didn't realize how kind of fragile it was because the binding is cracking and that sort of thing. So that's my reading. That's what I've been up to. That's what I'm up to in the future. Drinking lots of water here, trying to survive.